The Buick had been making a noise for 3 weeks before it finally gave up. Harold Pemberton had been telling himself it was nothing, just an old car being old, the way old things sometimes complained without any real cause for concern. He'd had the Buick for 19 years, bought it used the spring after Margaret passed, and it had never let him down. Not once. Not until today. He'd pulled off Route 29 just past the Gas and Go, coasting into the empty lot of a shuttered farm supply store that had been out of business since the recession. The engine had coughed twice, shuddered like a dog shaking off water, and then's gone silent. Now it wouldn't turn over at all, just a clicking sound, weak and pathetic when he turned the key. Harold sat behind the wheel and stared at the dashboard. He was 78 years old, a retired postal worker with a bad hip, and a heart that had needed 2 stents put in last year. His phone was at home on the kitchen counter because he kept forgetting to bring it with him, and the Gas and Go was at least a quarter-mile back up the road. A quarter-mile didn't sound like much unless you were 78 with a bad hip, and the afternoon sun was beating down on a stretch of asphalt that offered no shade. He got out of the car and lifted the hood, more out of habit than hope. He'd never been mechanical. That had been his brother Earl's gift, God rest him. Harold could sort mail and walk a route and remember the names of every dog on every porch, but engines were a mystery. He stared at the tangle of metal and rubber and wire and saw nothing that made any sense. That's when the truck pulled in. It was a red pickup, newer model, with oversized tires and a lift kit that seemed designed more for showing off than for any practical purpose. The windows were tinted dark, bass thumping from inside, and when the doors opened, 4 teenagers spilled out. 3 boys and a girl, all of them maybe 16 or 17, dressed in the expensive casual wear that Harold associated with kids who'd never had to work for anything. They didn't approach him. They stood by their truck about 30 feet away, and they looked at him, at his old Buick, at his white hair, at his weathered hands still resting uselessly on the edge of the hood, and they laughed. Harold heard the laughter clearly. It carried across the empty lot like something sharp and deliberate. "Yo, check out Grandpa," one of the boys said, loud enough to be heard. "Think he knows it's not 1965 anymore?" "That car's older than my mom," another one added. "Probably belongs in a museum." The girl took out her phone and pointed it at Harold. He couldn't tell if she was taking a picture or a video, but the gesture made his face flush with humiliation. He was a man who had served his community for 43 years, who had raised 2 children and buried a wife and never asked anyone for anything. And now he was standing on the side of the road being laughed at by children who didn't know him, who didn't care to know him, who saw only an old man with a broken car and found it amusing. "Hey, old-timer!" The first boy, tall with carefully styled hair and a smirk that looked practiced, took a few steps closer. "You need us to call you a tow truck? Or maybe a hearse?" More laughter. The girl was definitely recording now, her phone held steady, capturing the moment for whatever social media platform would give it the most attention. Harold lowered the hood slowly. His hands were trembling, though whether from anger or shame or simple exhaustion he couldn't say. He thought about Margaret, about what she would have said if she'd been here. She'd had a sharp tongue when she needed it, a way of putting people in their place with a single look. But Margaret was gone, and Harold was alone, and his voice had never been as strong as hers. "I'm fine," he said, though he wasn't. "Just waiting for a friend." It was a lie, and they probably knew it, but it was all he had. A friend? The tall boy grinned at his companions. What friend? The Grim Reaper? They howled at that, slapping each other's shoulders, drunk on their own cruelty. Harold turned away, leaning against the Buick, trying to make himself small. Maybe if he ignored them, they'd get bored. Maybe they'd leave. But they didn't leave. They kept talking, kept laughing, kept pointing. The girl walked closer, her phone still raised, narrating something Harold couldn't hear but could imagine. He felt tears building behind his eyes and willed them back. He would not cry, not here, not in front of these children who thought his pain was entertainment. He didn't hear the motorcycle at first. The blood was pounding too loudly in his ears, and the teenagers' laughter was too sharp and close. But then the laughter stopped, abruptly, like a switch being flipped, and Harold looked up to see what had silenced them. A Harley had pulled into the lot. It was black and chrome, polished to a shine that caught the afternoon sun, and the man riding it was built like a wall, broad shoulders, thick arms, a chest that strained against his leather vest. His head was shaved, his beard was dark and full, and his arms were covered in tattoos that disappeared beneath his sleeves. He wore sunglasses that hid his eyes, and he didn't remove them as he killed the engine and swung off the bike. The teenagers had gone very still. The tall boy's smirk had vanished, replaced by something that looked like uncertainty. The girl had lowered her phone. The biker walked past them without a glance, his boots heavy on the pavement, and stopped in front of Harold. "Having some trouble?" His voice was deep but not unkind. "Engine won't turn over." Harold's own voice came out steadier than he expected. "Been trying to figure it out, but I'm not much of a mechanic. Mind if I take a look?" "I'd appreciate that." The biker lifted the hood and leaned in, his big hands moving with a confidence Harold envied. He checked connections, tugged on wires, examined things Harold couldn't name. After a minute or so, he straightened up and nodded. "Starter's gone. You're not going anywhere without a tow." Harold's heart sank. A tow, a repair shop, bills he hadn't budgeted for. His Social Security check only stretched so far, and the stents last year had eaten through most of his savings. "I appreciate you looking," he said. "I'll figure something out." "You got a phone? Someone you can call?" "Left it at home." Harold shook his head, embarrassed. "I keep meaning to remember, but here." The biker pulled a phone from his vest pocket and held it out. "Use mine. Call whoever you need to call." Harold took the phone, but his mind was blank. His son lived in Colorado, his daughter in Florida. His neighbors were elderly themselves, most of them without cars. The only number he could think of was the auto shop on Main Street, but they'd want money he didn't have, and he couldn't bear to explain his situation to a stranger. He stopped, hating the way his voice cracked. "I don't know who to call." The biker was quiet for a moment. Then he turned and looked at the teenagers, who were still standing by their truck, watching the scene unfold with expressions that had shifted from amusement to apprehension. "You kids think something's funny?" The tall boy took a step back. "We weren't—" "I heard you." The biker's voice didn't rise, but it hardened. "I heard every word, laughing at an old man whose car broke down, taking videos, making jokes about death." He took a step toward them, and all four teenagers flinched. "That's what you think is entertainment? That's what passes for humor these days." "We were just messing around," the girl said, her voice thin. "We didn't mean anything by it." "You didn't mean anything." The biker repeated the words like they tasted sour. "You know what I see when I look at that man? I see someone who's probably worked his whole life, someone who's buried people he loved, someone who's earned the right to be treated with respect." He gestured toward Harold. "And you see a punchline." The teenagers said nothing. They looked at the ground, at each other, anywhere but at the man in front of them. "You want to make this right?" The biker crossed his arms. "Here's what you're going to do. You're going to apologize, and then you're going to help. You're going to give this man a ride wherever he needs to go, and you're going to treat him like the human being he is. Understood?" The tall boy swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." "I didn't hear you." "Yes, sir." Louder this time. The others nodded in agreement, their earlier bravado completely dissolved. The biker turned back to Harold. "Where do you need to go? Home?" Harold thought about it. His house was only a few miles away, but that wouldn't solve the problem of the car, the repair, the money. He felt the weight of it all pressing down on him, the loneliness, the struggle, the sense that the world had moved on and left him behind. "Home would be fine," he said quietly. "I can figure out the rest later." "You got family nearby? Someone who can help you sort this out?" "My kids are out of state. It's just me now." The biker studied him for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, a recognition, maybe, of a situation he understood better than Harold would have expected. "What's your name?" "Harold. Harold Pemberton." "I'm Marcus. People call me Tank." He extended his hand, and Harold shook it. The grip was firm but gentle. "Tell you what, Harold, these kids are going to give you a ride home, and I'm going to follow. Make sure you get there safe. Then we're going to figure out what to do about your car." "You don't have to do that. I don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden." Tank's voice softened. "You're a man who needs help. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with accepting it when it's offered." Harold felt the tears threatening again, but this time they weren't from shame. He blinked them back and nodded. "Okay," he said. "Thank you." Tank turned to the teenagers. "Well, you heard the man. Let's go." The tall boy opened the back door of the truck, his movements quick and nervous. The girl put her phone away. Harold noticed she'd stopped recording and climbed into the passenger seat. The other two boys made room in the back, their earlier swagger completely gone. Harold climbed into the truck, his bad hip protesting as he settled onto the leather seat. The interior smelled like fast food and expensive cologne, but the teenagers were quiet now, subdued, their eyes avoiding his. The tall boy started the engine and looked back at Tank, who had mounted his Harley and was waiting. "Lead the way," Tank said, "and drive careful. I'll be right behind you." The truck pulled out of the lot, the motorcycle following, and Harold Pemberton rode toward home in a silence that felt, for the first time in a long while, like something other than loneliness. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know how he'd pay for the repairs or get his car back or manage all the small crises that seemed to multiply with every passing year. But for now, he wasn't alone, and that, he was learning, made all the difference. Harold's house sat at the end of a quiet street in a neighborhood that had been middle class when he and Margaret moved there in 1972 and had slowly declined since. The lawns were smaller now, the trees older, the houses showing their age in peeling paint and sagging porches. Harold's place was in better shape than most. He still took pride in keeping it neat, but even he couldn't deny the roof needed work and the gutters had seen better days. The red pickup pulled into the driveway, and Tank's Harley rumbled to a stop at the curb. Harold climbed out slowly, his hips stiff from the short ride, and stood looking at the house where he'd lived for 52 years. It looked different. Somehow. Smaller. Lonelier. The teenagers got out too, standing awkwardly by their truck like soldiers awaiting orders. The tall one, Harold had learned his name was Brandon, kept glancing at Tank, who was dismounting his bike with the unhurried movements of a man who had nowhere else to be. "This is it," Harold said unnecessarily. "Home, sweet home." Tank walked up the driveway, his eyes scanning the property with an appraising look. He noted the overgrown hedges, the cracked concrete of the walkway, the screen door that hung slightly crooked on its hinges. Harold felt a flush of embarrassment. The place had gotten away from him in recent years. Things that Margaret would have noticed immediately, tasks she would have nagged him to complete, they'd piled up since she'd been gone, each small neglect adding to the next until the whole picture looked like defeat. "Nice place," Tank said, and somehow it didn't sound like a lie. "How long you been here?" "Since 72. Raised 2 kids in this house. Buried my wife from it." Harold fished his keys from his pocket. "It's too big for just me now, but I can't bring myself to sell. Too many memories." "Nothing wrong with memories." Tank turned to the teenagers, who were still hovering by the truck. "You 4, inside. I want to talk to you." Brandon's face went pale. "Sir, we're really sorry about what happened. We didn't mean—" "Inside." They filed past Harold into the house, their expensive sneakers squeaking on the hardwood floors of the entryway. Harold followed, flipping on lights, suddenly conscious of the dust on the mantel and the stack of newspapers he kept meaning to recycle. The living room smelled faintly of the pipe tobacco he sometimes allowed himself in the evenings, a habit Margaret had hated but tolerated. "Sit," Tank said, pointing to the couch. The teenagers sat. They looked absurdly young in Harold's living room, surrounded by furniture from another era, photographs of people they didn't know, a lifetime of accumulated objects that told a story they had no interest in hearing. The girl, her name was Ashley, Harold had gathered, was staring at a framed photo on the end table. It was Harold and Margaret on their 40th anniversary, both of them smiling, her hand resting on his arm in that casual way that spoke of decades of intimacy. "Is that your wife?" Ashley asked quietly. Harold nodded. "Margaret. She passed away 19 years ago. Cancer." Ashley looked away, something flickering across her face that might have been shame. Tank remained standing, his arms crossed, his presence filling the room in a way that made the space feel smaller. He let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, until the teenagers were squirming, until even Harold felt the urge to say something just to break the tension. "You know why I stopped today?" Tank finally asked. Brandon shook his head. "I stopped because I saw a man in trouble. That's what you do when you see someone who needs help. You stop. You don't drive by. You don't take out your phone and record it for laughs. You stop, and you do what you can." Tank's voice was level, almost conversational, but there was steel underneath. "That's what my father taught me. That's what his father taught him. It's called being a human being." "We know," one of the other boys mumbled. "We're sorry." "You're sorry because you got caught. There's a difference." Tank took a step closer to the couch. "Let me tell you something about the man you were laughing at. He's 78 years old. He spent 43 years delivering mail, rain, snow, heat, whatever. He got up every morning and did his job so that people like your parents could get their bills and their birthday cards and their letters from people they loved. Harold shifted uncomfortably. You don't have to. Yes, I do. Tank didn't look away from the teenagers. He raised 2 kids. He nursed his wife through cancer. He buried her and kept going, kept getting up every morning, kept taking care of this house, this neighborhood, this life. And today, when his car broke down and he was standing there trying to figure out what to do, you laughed at him. You made him feel like nothing. The room was silent. Ashley was crying now, silent tears sliding down her cheeks. Brandon was staring at his hands, his jaw tight. The other 2 boys looked like they wanted to disappear into the couch cushions. I'm not trying to make you feel bad for the sake of it, Tank continued, his voice softening slightly. I'm trying to teach you something. Every person you meet, every single one, has a story you don't know. They've loved people and lost people. They've worked hard and made sacrifices. They've earned the right to be treated with dignity, no matter how old they are, no matter what kind of car they drive, no matter how they look. He paused, letting the words sink in. You're young. You've got time to be better, but you've got to choose it. You've got to decide that the easy cruelty, the jokes, the videos, the laughing at people who can't fight back, that's not who you want to be. Tank looked at each of them in turn. So, who do you want to be? Another silence. Then Brandon spoke, his voice rough. I want to be better. He looked up at Tank, then at Harold. I'm sorry, Mr. Pemberton, really sorry. What we did was wrong. I'm sorry too, Ashley added, wiping her eyes. I deleted the video. I should never have taken it. The other 2 boys murmured their own apologies, and Harold found himself nodding, accepting, forgiving. It was easier than he'd expected. The anger he'd felt in that parking lot had faded, replaced by something more complicated. Pity, maybe, for kids who'd been taught to mock instead of help, who'd learned to see vulnerability as weakness instead of shared humanity. Thank you, he said. Apology accepted. Tank clapped his hands together, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Good. Now, we're going to do something useful. Brandon, you said your dad owns an auto shop? Brandon blinked, caught off guard. Yeah, Hendricks Auto, over on Miller Street. You're going to call him. You're going to explain what happened today, the truth, not some edited version, and you're going to ask him to tow Mr. Pemberton's car and fix it, at cost, no markup. He's not going to... He will if you tell him why, if you tell him what you did and how you're trying to make it right. Tank's expression brooked no argument. A man owns up to his mistakes. That's the first step to being better. You want to be better? Start now. Brandon pulled out his phone, his hand trembling slightly. He stepped into the kitchen to make the call, his voice audible through the doorway, halting at first, then steadier as he explained the situation. Harold couldn't hear everything, but he caught fragments. I messed up, Dad, and I need your help, and it's the right thing to do. When Brandon came back, his face was flushed, but his shoulders were straighter. He'll do it, he said. He's sending a truck now, and he said... Brandon swallowed. He said he's proud of me for calling. Tank nodded. Good. Now the rest of you. What can you do? The suggestions came slowly at first, then faster. Ashley offered to mow Harold's lawn and trim the hedges. One of the boys, Tyler, said his uncle was a handyman who might fix the screen door for free. The other boy, Marcus, not the same Marcus, Tank noted with a slight smile, volunteered to help clean out the gutters. Within 20 minutes, they had a plan. A schedule of tasks, a list of people to call, a small army of teenage labor committed to making right what they'd made wrong. Harold sat in his armchair and watched it unfold, bewildered and grateful, and something else he couldn't quite name. You didn't have to do all this, he said to Tank during a quiet moment when the teenagers were in the backyard, surveying the work to be done. No, I didn't. Tank settled into the chair across from him, the old springs creaking under his weight. But I wanted to, and they needed to. Why? You don't know me. You were just passing by. Tank was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to the photograph of Margaret on the end table. My grandfather raised me, he said finally. My parents weren't around. That's a whole other story. But my grandfather was. He was a tough old man. Korean War veteran, worked in a steel mill his whole life, hands like leather. He taught me everything I know about being a man. Harold waited, sensing there was more. When I was about 16, 17, I was running with a bad crowd, doing things I'm not proud of. One day, Grandpa sat me down and told me something I've never forgotten. He said, "The measure of a man isn't how he treats people who can help him, it's how he treats people who can't." Tank leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. I think about that every day. Every time I meet someone, every time I have a choice to make. And today, when I saw those kids laughing at you, I saw who I used to be. I saw the path I almost went down. He shook his head. I couldn't just ride by. I couldn't let them become what I almost became. Harold felt a lump forming in his throat. Your grandfather sounds like a wise man. He was. He passed about 10 years ago, but I still hear his voice, every day. Tank smiled, a real smile that softened his hard features. I think he'd like you, Harold. I think you two would have gotten along. I'd like to think so. The tow truck arrived 20 minutes later. Brandon's father, a stocky man with grease-stained hands and a bewildered expression, supervised the loading of the Buick, while his son explained the situation in more detail. Harold watched from the porch, Tank standing beside him, as the car that had been his faithful companion for 19 years was lifted onto the flatbed. I'll have it running by tomorrow, Mr. Hendricks said, approaching the porch. Starter's no problem. I'll check the rest of it too. Make sure nothing else is about to go. He extended his hand to Harold. I'm sorry about what happened today, Mr. Pemberton. My son knows better. He just forgot for a minute. He remembered when it mattered, Harold said, shaking the man's hand. That counts for something. Mr. Hendricks nodded, something like respect flickering in his eyes. Then he climbed into his truck and followed the tow vehicle down the street, his son in the passenger seat, the other teenagers piling into the red pickup to follow. Harold and Tank stood alone on the porch, watching the convoy disappear around the corner. What now? Harold asked. Tank reached into his vest and pulled out a card, plain white, with a phone number and a name, Marcus Tank Williams. Now you've got my number, he said. You need anything at all, you call. Doesn't matter what time, doesn't matter how small, you call. Harold took the card, turned it over in his fingers. Why would you do this for a stranger? Because that's what we do. Tank descended the porch steps, heading toward his Harley. And because you're not a stranger anymore, Harold, you're a friend. He mounted his bike, kicked the engine to life, and raised a hand in farewell. Then he was gone, the rumble of the Harley fading into the quiet of the afternoon. Harold stood on his porch for a long time, the card still in his hand, the silence of his house waiting behind him. It felt different now, less empty, less alone. He didn't know that Tank had already made 3 phone calls before reaching the end of the street. He didn't know that those calls would spread through a network of garages and clubhouses, churches and community centers. He didn't know that by morning his story would be known by hundreds of people who had never met him, but who understood what it meant to help someone who needed it. All he knew was that the world felt a little kinder than it had a few hours ago. And now that was enough. The teenagers came back the next morning. Harold was sitting at his kitchen table, working through his second cup of coffee and the crossword puzzle he did every day, when he heard the sound of car doors slamming in his driveway. He pushed himself up from the chair, his hip protesting the way it always did before he'd had a chance to walk the stiffness out, and made his way to the front window. The red pickup was parked at the curb. Brandon was unloading a lawnmower from the bed, while Tyler wrestled with a weed trimmer. Ashley stood on the sidewalk with a bucket of cleaning supplies, and Marcus, the other Marcus, the teenager, was already dragging a ladder from somewhere Harold couldn't see. He opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, still in his bathrobe, his coffee mug clutched in one hand. "Morning, Mr. Pemberton," Brandon called out, raising a hand in greeting. "Hope we're not too early." "It's 7:30 on a Saturday." "Yeah." Brandon grinned sheepishly. "My dad said if we were going to do this, we were going to do it right. That means starting early." Harold looked at the assembled teenagers, their work clothes, their tools, their earnest expressions, and felt something shift in his chest. Yesterday, these same kids had mocked him. Today, they were here to help. The transformation was so complete, so unexpected, that he almost didn't trust it. "You really don't have to do this," he said. "We know." Ashley climbed the porch steps and stood in front of him, her eyes steady. "But we want to. What we did yesterday was wrong. Saying sorry isn't enough. We need to show it." Harold studied her face, young, unlined, still holding the softness of adolescence. She reminded him, a little, of his daughter Karen at that age. The same stubborn set to the jaw, the same determination in the eyes. "All right," he said, "but I'm making breakfast first. Nobody works on an empty stomach." He made pancakes. It had been years since he'd cooked for anyone but himself, and his hands were clumsy at first. Measuring the wrong amount of flour, burning the first batch, fumbling with the spatula. But by the time the teenagers had finished their initial survey of the property, he had a stack of passable pancakes on a plate and a fresh pot of coffee brewing. They ate in his kitchen, crowded around a table meant for two, passing syrup and butter and talking over each other in the way that young people did. Harold listened more than he spoke, absorbing their chatter about school and sports and music and the thousand small dramas that seemed so important at their age. It was overwhelming and exhausting and wonderful, like opening a window in a room that had been closed too long. Mr. Pemberton. Brandon had finished his third pancake and was eyeing the last one on the stack. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. What was it like, being a mailman for so long? Harold considered the question. It was the kind of thing people rarely asked him anymore. The kind of genuine curiosity that assumed his life was interesting, that his stories were worth hearing. It was hard work, he said, harder than people think, walking miles every day in every kind of weather, carrying bags that weighed 40, 50 pounds, dealing with dogs that wanted to eat you and people who blamed you for bills they didn't want to receive. Sounds rough. It was, but it was good too. You got to know people, really know them. You saw them every day, watched their kids grow up, brought them letters from sons overseas and postcards from friends in far-off places. You were part of their lives in this small but steady way. Harold smiled, remembering. Margaret used to say I knew more secrets than a priest. People wrote things in letters they'd never say out loud. Did you read them? Ashley asked, then blushed. Sorry, that's probably a rude question. No, I didn't read them, but I knew what they meant just from looking at the envelopes. A letter with tear stains on it, a package wrapped too carefully, a card with a child's handwriting and a grandmother's address. Harold shook his head. You learn to read between the lines. You learn that every piece of mail is part of someone's story. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. The teenagers looked at him with something Harold hadn't seen in their eyes before. Respect, maybe, or interest, or just the dawning recognition that the old man in front of them was more than a punchline. That's really cool, Mr. Pemberton, Tyler said. I never thought about mail that way. Most people don't. That's okay. The job's not about being noticed. It's about showing up, day after day, year after year, doing the small things that keep the world connected. He pushed back from the table and gathered the empty plates. All right, enough talk. You kids came here to work, and I'm not going to let you waste the morning on an old man's stories. They worked until noon. Brandon mowed the lawn with a precision that surprised Harold, making neat rows, edging carefully around Margaret's old flower beds. Tyler attacked the hedges with the weed trimmer, transforming the overgrown bushes into something resembling their original shapes. Ashley scrubbed the porch railings and cleaned the windows until they sparkled. Marcus climbed the ladder and cleared years of debris from the gutters, filling bag after bag with rotted leaves and broken twigs. Harold tried to help, but they wouldn't let him. Every time he picked up a rake or reached for a brush, someone gently took it from his hands and steered him back to the porch chair they'd set up in the shade. You're supervising, Mr. Pemberton, Brandon said firmly. That's an important job, too. So Harold supervised. He watched these 4 teenagers, who had been strangers yesterday, who had been cruel to him for no reason except that they could, transform his neglected property into something he could be proud of again. And he thought about second chances, about how easily he could have written them off, how easily they could have driven away and never looked back. But they hadn't, and he hadn't. And here they were. Around 11, a truck pulled up to the curb. Hendricks Auto, the same company that had towed his Buick yesterday. Brandon's father climbed out, and behind him, rumbling off a flatbed, was Harold's car. She's all fixed, Mr. Hendricks said, walking up the driveway with a set of keys in his hand. New starter, new battery, fresh oil change. I checked the belts and hoses, too. They were getting worn. Replaced them while I was at it. Harold reached for his wallet, but Mr. Hendricks held up a hand. No charge. I can't let you do that. The parts alone must have cost. Mr. Pemberton. Mr. Hendricks looked him straight in the eye. My son told me what happened yesterday, what he did, and what that man on the motorcycle did, and what it meant to him. He came home different. Better. He glanced at Brandon, who was pretending not to listen while edging the flower beds. That's worth more than a starter and some hoses. That's worth everything. Harold felt the familiar prick of tears and didn't fight them this time. He took the keys with a trembling hand and nodded. Thank you, he said. Thank you for raising a boy who could learn from his mistakes. Thank you for giving him the chance to. Mr. Hendricks climbed back in his truck and drove away. Harold stood in his driveway, keys in hand, looking at his old Buick, washed, waxed, gleaming in the midday sun like it had just rolled off the lot. At noon, he ordered pizza. It was the least he could do, and besides, he'd missed the sound of young voices filling his house. They ate on the back patio, which Ashley had swept and Marcus had hosed down, the spring sunshine warming their faces. "Mr. Pemberton." Ashley set down her slice and looked at him with an expression that seemed older than her years. "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask. I might not answer." "Do you get lonely, living here by yourself?" The question hung in the air. Harold took his time chewing, swallowing, wiping his mouth with a napkin, buying time to formulate an answer that was honest without being pitiful. "Yes," he finally said, "I do. Margaret's been gone almost 20 years, and I still wake up some mornings expecting to see her in the kitchen making coffee. My kids live far away, not because they don't care, but because that's where life took them. Friends have passed on or moved away. The world gets smaller when you get old, Ashley. The circle shrinks." "That sounds really hard." "It is, but it's also just life. Everyone ends up alone eventually, if they live long enough. The trick is figuring out how to fill the time with things that matter." Harold looked around the table at these 4 young faces. "Today matters. What you're doing here, it matters. Not just to me, but to you. You're learning something that'll stay with you long after I'm gone." "What's that?" Brandon asked. "That kindness isn't complicated. It's just showing up. It's just noticing when someone needs help and doing something about it. You don't need money or power or special skills. You just need to pay attention and give a damn." The teenagers were quiet, absorbing his words. Harold could see them processing, filing this conversation away in whatever part of the brain stores things that end up mattering later. "My grandfather used to say something similar," Brandon said slowly, "before he passed. He said the measure of a life isn't what you accumulate, it's what you leave behind in other people. Your grandfather was a wise man." "He was." Brandon smiled, a real smile, without the smirk that had twisted his features yesterday. "I think he'd like you, Mr. Pemberton." "I'd like to think so." They finished the pizza, cleaned up, and spent another 2 hours on the remaining tasks. By 3 o'clock, Harold's house looked better than it had in years. The lawn was manicured, the hedges trimmed, the gutters clear. The screen door hung straight on new hinges that Tyler's uncle had come by to install. The windows sparkled, the porch gleamed, and somewhere along the way, someone had planted a row of marigolds along the walkway, Margaret's favorite flower. Harold stood in his driveway and took it all in. His house, his home, the place where he'd built a life, raised a family, loved and lost, and kept going anyway. It looked cared for again. It looked like someone lived there who mattered. The teenagers gathered by the red pickup, sweaty and grass-stained, and looking more satisfied than Harold had ever seen young people look after a day of manual labor. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. "All of you. This means more than I can say." "We'll be back," Ashley said. "Next Saturday, if that's okay." "You don't have to." "We want to." She glanced at the others who nodded in agreement. "And not just for work. Maybe just to visit, hang out, hear more stories about being a mailman." Harold felt something crack open in his chest, the loneliness he'd been carrying for so long, finally letting in a little light. "I'd like that," he said. "I'd like that very much." They drove away with waves and promises to return. Harold watched until the truck disappeared around the corner, then turned back to his house. His transformed, revitalized, cared-for house. He didn't know that Tank had spent the morning making more calls. He didn't know that word of his situation had spread through networks he couldn't imagine. He didn't know that tomorrow would bring another surprise, bigger than anything he'd experienced today. All he knew was that his lawn was mowed, his gutters were clean, and 4 teenagers who had been cruel to him yesterday had become something like friends. The world was strange and unpredictable, and full of more kindness than he'd remembered. Harold went inside, sat down in his armchair, and smiled at the photograph of Margaret on the end table. "You'd never believe it, Maggie," he said aloud. "You'd never believe what happened today." And somewhere, he was certain, she was smiling back. Sunday morning arrived with a stillness that Harold had grown accustomed to over the years. He woke at 6, as he always did, made his coffee, retrieved the newspaper from the porch, and settled into his routine. The house looked different in the early light, cleaner, brighter, somehow more alive. The marigolds along the walkway caught the first rays of sun and seemed to glow. He was halfway through the sports section when he heard it, a distant rumble, low and rhythmic, like thunder, rolling in from far away. but the sky was clear, not a cloud in sight. Harold set down his coffee and listened. The sound grew louder, closer, resolving into something unmistakable. Engines, dozens of them, maybe more. He pushed himself up from the table and walked to the front window. What he saw made him grip the curtain for support. Motorcycles were turning onto his street. Not 5 or 10, but wave after wave, a river of chrome and leather, flowing toward his house like something out of a dream. They filled the road from curb to curb, their headlights blazing even in the morning sun, their riders sitting tall and steady. Harold opened his front door and stepped onto the porch, still in his slippers, his coffee forgotten on the table. The first bikes were pulling into his driveway now, others lining up along the street, engines idling in a chorus that vibrated in his chest. He tried to count them and lost track somewhere past 60. At the head of the procession, killing his engine and dismounting with familiar ease, was Tank. "Morning, Harold." Tank walked up the driveway like this was the most natural thing in the world, like showing up at an old man's house with 60 motorcycles was just a typical Sunday activity. "Hope we didn't wake you." "What?" Harold's voice failed him. He cleared his throat and tried again. "What is all this?" "This is the Steel Brotherhood, Oklahoma chapter, plus some friends from Kansas and Texas who wanted to make the trip." Tank turned and gestured at the assembled riders, who were dismounting and gathering on the lawn, on the sidewalk, in the street. "They heard about what happened. They wanted to meet you." "Meet me? Why would they want to meet me?" "Because you're one of us now." Tank reached into his vest and pulled out something small and metallic. He held it up so Harold could see. A pin, bronze and circular, with an eagle and the words Steel Brotherhood engraved around the edge. "This means you've got family. Wherever you go, whatever you need, there's someone who's got your back." Harold took the pin with trembling fingers. It was warm from Tank's pocket, heavier than it looked. He turned it over, studying the craftsmanship, trying to comprehend what it represented. "I didn't do anything to earn this." "You survived." Tank's voice softened. "You worked your whole life, raised a family, lost your wife, and kept going. You faced down cruelty with dignity. You forgave kids who didn't deserve forgiveness and gave them a chance to be better." He placed a hand on Harold's shoulder. "That's more than most people do in a lifetime, Harold. That's everything." The riders were approaching now, forming a loose semicircle around the porch. Harold saw men and women of every age, grizzled veterans with gray beards and young riders with fresh tattoos, weathered faces marked by hard living and bright eyes full of life. They wore leather vests covered in patches, each one telling a story Harold couldn't read but somehow understood. One by one, they introduced themselves. There was Maggie, a woman in her 60s who'd been riding since before Harold retired, who shook his hand with a grip that belied her silver hair. There was Joaquin, a former Marine with scars on his arms, and a gentle voice, who told Harold about his grandfather, who'd also been a mailman in another town, another time. There was a young woman named Riley, who couldn't have been older than 25, who said she'd driven 6 hours from Wichita because some things are worth showing up for. Each of them had a story. Each of them had a reason for being here, and each of them looked at Harold not with pity or condescension, but with respect, the kind of respect you give to someone who has earned it through the simple act of living well. "We brought some things," Tank said, once the introductions had wound down. "Stuff we thought you might need." He gestured toward the street, and Harold saw for the first time that several of the motorcycles were towing small trailers. Riders began unloading boxes and bags, carrying them up the driveway with the coordinated efficiency of people who had done this before. "What kind of things?" Harold asked, overwhelmed. "Groceries. Enough to fill your pantry twice over. Some gift cards for the places around town, hardware store, pharmacy, that diner on Main Street." Tank paused. "And something else, something special." He led Harold around the side of the house to the backyard. The grass was still damp with morning dew, the marigolds nodding in a light breeze, and there, in the center of the yard, was something that made Harold's breath catch in his throat. A bench, handcrafted from dark wood, polished to a shine, with a small brass plaque mounted on the backrest. Harold walked toward it slowly, his hip forgotten, his eyes fixed on the words engraved on the plaque. "In memory of Margaret Pemberton, beloved wife, mother, and friend, love never ends." Harold sank onto the bench. The wood was smooth beneath his hands, warm from the sun. He traced the letters of Margaret's name with one finger, feeling the grooves, reading them over and over until they blurred with tears. "How did you know?" he whispered. Tank sat down beside him, the bench creaking slightly under his weight. "Brandon told us. After yesterday, he went home and couldn't stop talking about you, about the stories you told, about your wife, about the life you'd built. His dad called me and we got the idea. One of our guys is a woodworker. He stayed up all night finishing it. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything." Tank looked out at the yard, at the marigolds, at the house that had been transformed in 2 short days. "This is what we do. We take care of our own. And you're one of our own now, Harold, whether you like it or not." Harold laughed, a wet sound that was half sob and half joy. "I think I can live with that." They sat together in silence for a while, the sounds of the gathering filling the air behind them, voices and laughter and the clinking of dishes as someone set up a folding table on the lawn. Harold closed his eyes and let the warmth of the sun soak into his bones, let the presence of all these strangers-turned-friends settle around him like a blanket. "My grandfather would have loved this," Tank said eventually. "He always said the best things in life aren't things at all. They're moments, connections, the feeling of being part of something bigger than yourself. He sounds like a wise man." He was. I miss him every day. Tank stood, brushing off his jeans. "Come on. There's food to eat and people to meet. And I think someone brought a cake." Harold let Tank help him to his feet. His hip ached, his eyes were red, and he felt more exhausted than he had in years. But underneath all that, there was something else. A warmth, a lightness, a sense of belonging he hadn't felt since Margaret was alive. The cookout lasted until late afternoon. The Steel Brotherhood had brought everything: hamburgers and hot dogs, potato salad and coleslaw, a sheet cake decorated with the words, "Welcome to the family." They set up chairs and tables on Harold's lawn, commandeered his grill, and turned his quiet backyard into a celebration that drew curious neighbors from up and down the street. The teenagers came too, Brandon and Ashley, Tyler and Marcus, looking slightly awed by the crowd of bikers, but determined to be part of whatever was happening. Brandon spent an hour talking to Joaquin about the Marine Corps. Ashley helped Maggie distribute plates and napkins. Tyler and Marcus got drafted into dish duty and didn't complain once. Harold moved through it all in a daze, shaking hands and accepting well wishes, telling stories about his mail route and listening to stories about life on the road. He learned about club runs and charity rides, about veterans' causes and community service, about the code that bound these people together: loyalty, honor, respect, the same values he'd tried to live by his whole life, just wearing different clothes. Around 4 o'clock, when the crowd was starting to thin and the last of the cake had been consumed, Tank found Harold sitting on Margaret's bench, looking out at the yard, full of people. "Hell of a day," Tank said, settling beside him. "Hell of a weekend." Harold shook his head slowly. 3 days ago, I was just an old man with a broken car. Now I've got—" He gestured at the scene before them. "I don't even know what to call this." "Family." Tank said it simply, like it was obvious. "You've got family. I have 2 kids who live 1,000 miles away. I haven't had family nearby in years. Family isn't about blood, Harold. It's about who shows up, who's there when you need them, who sees you when the rest of the world looks away." Tank leaned back, his gaze distant. These people, they'd ride through a blizzard to help someone they'd never met, just because it was the right thing to do. That's family. That's what it means to belong to something bigger than yourself. Harold thought about the teenagers who had mocked him, then returned to make things right. He thought about Tank, who had stopped on a random stretch of road because he saw someone in trouble. He thought about the 60 riders who had driven from 3 states to meet an old man they'd only heard about through the grapevine. "I spent 43 years delivering other people's mail," he said. "Letters from sons to mothers, cards from friends to friends, packages full of love and hope and connection. I always thought I was just the messenger, just the guy who walked the route. You were more than that. Maybe. I don't know." Harold looked down at the pin in his hand, the bronze eagle, the words "Steel Brotherhood" carved in metal. "But I know this. I'm not going to waste whatever time I've got left. I'm going to show up, pay attention, give a damn, like I told those kids, because that's what all of you have shown me. That's what you've given me." Tank nodded slowly. "That's all any of us can do, Harold. Just show up. The rest takes care of itself." The sun was setting by the time the last motorcycle pulled away. The yard was clean, the tables folded and loaded into trailers, the grill cooling in the evening air. Harold stood on his porch and watched the taillights disappear one by one, the rumble of engines fading into the quiet of the neighborhood. Brandon's truck was the last to go. The teenager rolled down his window and called out across the lawn. "Same time next Saturday, Mr. Pemberton?" Harold smiled. "I'll have the pancakes ready." Brandon grinned and drove away, leaving Harold alone with his house, his yard, and the bench in the backyard, where Margaret's name was carved in brass. He walked back there as the stars were coming out, lowering himself onto the smooth wood, feeling the last warmth of the day radiating from the polished surface. The marigolds had closed for the night, their orange petals folded tight. The air smelled like grass and smoke and something else, something he could only describe as hope. "You should see this, Maggie," he said to the empty yard, to the photograph in the living room, to the memory that lived in every corner of this house. "You should see what's happened, what these people have done." He sat there until the chill drove him inside, then locked the door and made his way to bed. For the first time in years, he fell asleep without the television on, without needing noise to fill the silence. The silence wasn't so empty anymore. 6 months later, Harold Pemberton stood at the front of Grace Community Church, looking out at a crowd he barely recognized. The pews were packed. Steel Brotherhood members in their leather vests sat shoulder to shoulder with retirees from the neighborhood, teenagers from the local high school, postal workers in their blue uniforms. Brandon and his friends were in the third row, dressed in clothes that looked uncomfortable but appropriate. Tank sat near the back, his massive frame somehow respectful in the wooden pew, his eyes fixed on Harold with an expression of quiet pride. Harold cleared his throat. His hands trembled slightly against the podium, but his voice was steady when he spoke. 6 months ago, my car broke down on Route 29. I was 78 years old, alone, and stranded. Some teenagers drove by and laughed at me, took videos, made jokes about death. He paused, letting the words settle, and then a man on a motorcycle pulled up and changed my life. He told the story from the beginning. The broken Buick, the mocking teenagers, Tank's arrival, the apologies and the work crew and the Saturday mornings that had become a tradition, the cookout that had filled his yard with strangers who became family, the bench in the backyard where he sat every evening now, talking to Margaret like she could still hear him. "I spent most of my life thinking I was invisible," Harold said. "Just an old man in an old house waiting for the end. But these past 6 months have taught me something. Nobody is invisible. We only think we are because we've stopped looking at each other, stopped seeing, stopped paying attention to the people right in front of us." He looked at Brandon, who was sitting very still, his eyes glistening. "Those kids who laughed at me, they weren't bad people. They were just young. They hadn't learned yet that every stranger has a story, that every old person was once young, that the line between cruelty and kindness is thinner than we think." Harold smiled. "But they learned. They showed up the next day, and the day after that, and every Saturday since. They learned that making something right feels better than breaking it ever could." He looked at Tank, whose face was unreadable, but whose presence anchored the room. And the man who stopped, Tank, Marcus, whatever you want to call him, he didn't know me, had no reason to help, but he stopped anyway because that's who he is, because he was raised to believe that the measure of a man is how he treats people who can't do anything for him. Harold's voice cracked slightly, and he paused to collect himself. "I'm here today because this church asked me to speak about community, about what it means to belong to something, and the only answer I have is this: community isn't a place. It's not a building or a neighborhood or a zip code. Community is what happens when people decide to see each other, when they stop looking away, when they show up again and again, for no reason except that it's the right thing to do." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the bronze pin Tank had given him, the eagle, the words Steel Brotherhood gleaming in the light from the stained glass windows. "I'm 78 years old. I've got a bad hip and a heart with 2 stents and more years behind me than ahead, but I've never felt more alive than I do right now, because I'm not invisible anymore, because I have people who see me, who show up for me, and I have the chance to do the same for them." He looked out at the crowd one more time, memorizing the faces, storing them in the part of his heart where Margaret still lived. "That's all I have to say. Thank you for listening, and thank you, all of you, for teaching an old man that it's never too late to find where you belong." The applause started slowly, then built into something thunderous. People rose to their feet, the bikers first, then the teenagers, then the rest of the congregation. until the whole church was standing clapping, some of them openly weeping. Harold stood at the podium and let it wash over him, feeling the warmth of it, the weight of it, the undeniable reality that he mattered. After the service, the crowd spilled out into the parking lot, where the Steel Brotherhood had set up tables of food and drinks for a community celebration. It was Tank's idea, a way to introduce the club to the neighborhood, to show that the leather and the tattoos didn't mean what people assumed they meant. Harold made his way through the crowd, shaking hands and accepting hugs, feeling like a minor celebrity in a world he'd thought had forgotten him. Children he didn't know ran past, chasing each other around the parked motorcycles. Elderly neighbors who hadn't spoken to him in years stopped to tell him how moved they'd been by his words. Brandon found him near the dessert table, a plate of cookies in hand. "That was a great speech, Mr. Pemberton." "You think so? I'm not much of a public speaker." "You're better than you think." Brandon hesitated, then plunged ahead. "I wanted to tell you something. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about paying attention, about seeing people, and I decided I want to do something with that. After graduation, I mean." "What kind of something?" "Social work, helping people who feel invisible, old people, homeless people, anyone who's fallen through the cracks." Brandon's face was earnest, younger somehow than it had looked that day on Route 29. "You showed me that one person can make a difference. I want to be that person for someone else." Harold set down his coffee cup and placed a hand on Brandon's shoulder. "You already are," he said. "You already are." Tank appeared at his elbow as Brandon drifted away to rejoin his friends. "Hell of a speech, old man." "You think Margaret heard it?" "I think she was in the front row." Tank handed him a bottle of water. "You look tired. You should sit down." "I've spent 78 years sitting down. I'm done sitting." Harold looked out at the crowd, the bikers and the teenagers and the neighbors and the strangers who had become something more. "I want to remember this. Every face, every voice. I want to carry it with me." "You will?" Tank's voice was gentle. "That's what memories are for." They stood together in the afternoon sun, watching the celebration unfold. Children laughed and ran, adults talked and ate. The Steel Brotherhood mingled with the congregation like they'd always belonged there, which maybe, in some way that mattered more than appearances, they always had. "What happens now?" Harold asked. "Now? Same as always. We keep showing up, keep paying attention, keep doing the small things that add up to something big." Tank smiled, the expression softening his hard features. "That's the secret, Harold. There's no grand plan. There's just today, and what you do with it." Harold thought about all the days he'd wasted, the years after Margaret died when he'd sleepwalked through life, the mornings he'd dreaded getting out of bed, the evenings he'd spent talking to the television, because there was no one else to hear him. Those days were over. "I've got an idea," he said slowly. "Something I've been thinking about." "What's that?" "A program for seniors who are alone, who feel invisible like I did. We pair them with volunteers who visit regularly, check in on them, make sure they know someone cares." Harold's eyes brightened as the idea took shape. "We could call it No One Invisible. Get the church involved, and the club, and the kids from the high school. Build something that lasts." Tank was quiet for a moment, studying Harold's face. Then he nodded. "I know some people who'd want to help with that. Let me make some calls." "Always making calls. It's what I do." Tank clapped him on the shoulder. "You're not just a member of this family anymore, Harold. You're becoming a leader, whether you meant to or not." Harold laughed, a full, genuine laugh that felt foreign in his throat but welcome all the same. "At 78? A leader? Best kind. You've got nothing to prove and everything to give." Tank started walking toward his motorcycle, then paused and looked back. "Same time next Saturday? I'll have the pancakes ready." Tank grinned and walked away, leaving Harold alone in the crowd, but not lonely. Never lonely, not anymore. The No One Invisible program launched 3 months later. It started small, a handful of volunteers visiting a dozen seniors, but it grew quickly. The Steel Brotherhood adopted it as one of their official charity projects. Brandon and his friends recruited classmates to participate. The local news did a story, then another, then a whole series about the retired mailman who was changing lives one visit at a time. Harold spoke at the launch event, shorter this time, but no less powerful. He told the story of his breakdown on Route 29, of the teenagers who laughed and the biker who stopped, of the transformation that followed. And he ended with the same words he'd used at the church. "Nobody is invisible. We only think we are because we've stopped looking at each other, So let's start looking again. Let's see each other. Let's show up. The applause was thunderous. The volunteers were eager. The program was real. A year later, on the anniversary of the day his car broke down, Harold sat on Margaret's bench in his backyard, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. The marigolds were blooming again. The teenagers had replanted them in the spring, and they'd come back stronger than ever. He thought about everything that had happened, the mockery that had become mentorship, the stranger who had become family, the loneliness that had become purpose. Tank had been right. There was no grand plan. There was just today, and what you did with it. Harold pulled out his phone. He remembered to carry it everywhere now, and typed a message to the group chat that had become his lifeline. Brandon and Ashley, Tyler and Marcus, Tank and Maggie, and Joaquin, and a dozen others whose names he'd learned over the past year. Sunset's beautiful tonight. Wish you could all see it. The responses came quickly. Heart emojis, and photos of other sunsets from other places, words of affection from people who had started as strangers and become something more. Harold smiled and put the phone away. He leaned back on the bench, felt the smooth wood beneath his hands, read the words on the brass plaque without needing to look at them. In memory of Margaret Pemberton, beloved wife, mother, and friend. Love never ends. You were right, Maggie, he said to the evening air, to the marigolds, to the memory that lived in every corner of his heart. Love never ends. It just finds new places to grow. The sun dipped below the horizon. The stars began to appear. And Harold Pemberton, retired mailman, widower, invisible man no more, sat in his backyard and felt, for the first time in decades, like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The journey that had started with a broken car on Route 29 had led him here, to purpose, to family, to a life that mattered. And it was only just beginning.